A barefoot and hungry girl saw a man shivering in the rain. Even though she had almost nothing, she shared her last piece of bread with him. But the next day, a luxury car pulled up beside her. When the door opened, she froze. The man inside was the last person she expected to see. What happened next changed her life forever. Stay until the end to uncover this shocking twist and subscribe for more heart-touching stories. The winter wind cut through Emily's thin jacket as she huddled in the doorway of an abandoned store, her small fingers clutching a piece of stale bread. At 10 years old, she had already learned to make difficult choices that no child should face. The bread could last another day if she was careful, but the old man shivering under the bridge hadn't eaten in 3 days. She'd been watching him, counting his meals just as she counted her own. Rain began to fall, turning the Cleveland streets into mirrors that reflected the harsh neon lights of downtown. Emily pulled her worn backpack closer, protecting the precious photograph inside. The last image of her family, taken just months before the fire that had taken everything from her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, as clear as the day they were spoken. Never stop being kind, even if the world isn't kind to you. Rising from her shelter, Emily made her decision. Her feet, protected only by shoes 2 sizes too big, carried her through puddles toward the bridge. The old man was exactly where she had last seen him, curled up in a ragged blanket that had once been blue. His eyes, when they met hers, held the same haunted look she sometimes saw in store windows when she caught her own reflection. "Here," she said, holding out the bread. "You need it more than me." He took the bread with shaking fingers, and as the streetlight caught his face, Emily saw tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. His grip on her hand was surprisingly strong as he whispered, "You saved more than just my hunger tonight." Emily pulled away, uncomfortable with the intensity in his eyes, and retreated into the shadows. That night, she slept in her usual spot behind the dumpster of Joe's Pizza, where the kitchen vents kept the area somewhat warm. Her dreams were filled with memories of her mother's smile and the smell of fresh-baked cookies from their tiny apartment kitchen. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the usual sounds of the city awakening. Emily was gathering her few belongings when she heard the distinctive purr of an expensive car engine. A black sedan had stopped at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the early morning light. The rear door opened, and a man in an impeccable suit stepped out. Her heart began to race. Adults in nice suits meant trouble. She had learned that lesson from her Aunt Sarah, who had taken her in after the fire only to throw her out 2 weeks later, more interested in keeping the insurance money than caring for her dead sister's child. The man's shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the wet pavement as he approached. "Emily?" His voice was soft but carried authority. "My name is James Marshall. I represent Mr. Michael Warren. The gentleman you helped last night would like to speak with you." "I understand your caution," he said, reaching slowly into his pocket and withdrawing a business card. "Mr. Warren simply wishes to thank you properly. This card has my number and office address. You can verify everything I'm saying." Emily remained frozen, her back pressed against the rough brick wall. The man returned to his car, and she watched as it merged smoothly into the morning traffic. Only then did she dart forward to snatch the card, stuffing it into her pocket without reading it. That evening, as she made her way to the shelter where she sometimes stayed, Emily noticed something different. The usual crowd of homeless people seemed agitated, gathered in small groups, whispering. She caught fragments of conversation about a wealthy man who had disappeared months ago, only to resurface in the most unexpected way. Sister Mary, who ran the shelter's kitchen, was usually happy to see Emily, but tonight her smile seemed strained. "Emily, dear, there's been someone asking about you. A lawyer." Emily's blood ran cold. The last time lawyers had been involved, she had lost everything. Without a word, she turned and fled into the gathering darkness, the business card burning a hole in her pocket. But as she ran through the shadows between buildings, a terrible feeling crept over her, the feeling of being watched. She ducked into an alley, her heart pounding, and pressed herself against the cold wall. Footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, drawing closer. Emily held her breath, clutching her backpack with its precious photograph. The footsteps paused at the alley's entrance, and a shadow stretched across the ground before her. "You don't understand," another voice replied, the tone urgent and familiar. "There's something about her, something I need to remember." The name meant nothing to her, but the address was in the wealthy part of town where she used to dream of living. Tears blurred her vision as she remembered her mother's words about kindness. But her mother had also taught her another lesson, one learned in the hardest way possible. Sometimes kindness comes with a price too high to pay. As the night deepened around her, Emily made a decision. She would go to the address tomorrow, but she would be careful. She had survived this long by being cautious, and she wasn't about to stop now. What she didn't know was that her simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways she could never have imagined. Michael Warren sat in his vast office at the top of Warren Enterprises, staring at his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him seemed foreign, clean-shaven, perfectly groomed, wrapped in an expensive suit that felt like a costume. Just days ago, he had been sleeping under a bridge, his beard matted, clothes stained with months of life on the streets. The transformation felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the coffee cup on his desk. The withdrawal symptoms were fading, but the memories remained sharp and clear. Especially the memory of the little girl with eyes too old for her face, sharing her only piece of bread with a stranger. There was something about her that tugged at the edges of his consciousness, something he couldn't quite grasp. The door opened without a knock, and Thomas strode in. His younger brother had always carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed they deserved everything they had. But now there was something else in his bearing, a hardness that hadn't been there before Michael's breakdown. "The board is getting nervous," Thomas announced, dropping into a chair. "Your little sabbatical cost us millions in market value, and now instead of focusing on damage control, you're obsessing over some homeless kid." The words stung because they carried truth. A year ago, after Catherine's death, Michael had simply broken. The pressure of running the company, the guilt over working through their entire marriage, the rumors about the circumstances of her death. It had all become too much. He had walked out of this very office one day and kept walking until Michael Warren, CEO, had disappeared into the anonymous masses of the city's homeless. "This is different," Michael said quietly. "There's something about her, something familiar." Michael stood, reaching for his coat, but Thomas blocked his path. "Think about what you're doing. The media is already having a field day with your return. Do you really want to add a scandal about you stalking a minor?" Michael shrugged off his brother's hand. "I'll risk what I need to." Sister Mary glanced nervously at the door. "There was a man here earlier, well-dressed. He was asking about Emily too, but something felt wrong. He said he represented her family's interests, but Emily told me once that she has no family left." As they cruised the darkening streets, Michael's mind wandered to the last time he had seen Catherine. They had argued about his work hours, about his absence from home, about the strange phone calls she had been receiving. She had tried to tell him something was wrong at the company, that she had discovered something in the records, but he had dismissed her concerns as paranoia. 2 days later, she was dead. Car accident, they said, brake failure. He had been too deep in his grief to question it then, but during his months on the street, pieces had started coming together. Fragments of conversations overheard in board meetings, documents he had signed without reading carefully enough, projects that had moved forward despite safety concerns. James pulled over, and Michael stepped out into the cold night air. He approached the alley slowly, not wanting to frighten Emily if it was her. But the small figure pressed against the wall was too still to be a child. It was a bundle of rags, arranged to look like a person. Michael nodded, a mixture of pride and sadness tightening his chest. A child shouldn't need such skills. He was about to return to the car when he noticed something half hidden beneath the fake bundle, a worn business card. His business card. She had been here, leaving him a message, or more scared. Michael picked up the card, noting how the edges were worn smooth, as if someone had been turning it over and over in their hands. What happened while I was gone, James? What did Thomas do? Before he could continue, Michael's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The girl knows too much. Handle it, or I will. They returned to the car, and as they pulled away from the curb, Michael caught a glimpse of a dark figure stepping out of the shadows. The streetlight caught the man's face for just a moment, but it was enough. It was Roberts, Thomas's head of security. As they drove through the city, Michael's mind returned to Emily. There was something in her face, something in the way she moved, that pulled at his memories. He had seen her somewhere before, long ago, but where? James turned onto a side street, then another, making sure they weren't being followed. But Michael barely noticed. His attention was fixed on a realization that had just struck him. Emily looked exactly like Catherine had in the old photograph on his desk. The one from her childhood, taken at the orphanage where she had grown up. James met his eyes in the rearview mirror, understanding dawning on his face. "Sir, are you suggesting—" As they drove into the night, Michael felt the weight of too many coincidences pressing down on him. One way or another, he would find the truth. He just prayed he would find it before Thomas did. Emily woke to the sound of rain drumming against the metal dumpster that sheltered her makeshift bed. The cardboard beneath her had grown damp despite her careful arrangement of plastic bags, and the cold had seeped into her bones. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, her fingers brushing against the photograph in her pocket, her most precious possession, protected in a Ziploc bag she had found outside a convenience store. The events of the previous day felt like a dream. The man in the expensive suit, the business card, the whispered conversations at the shelter. But the feeling of being watched remained very real. As she gathered her few belongings, Emily's eyes scanned the alley constantly, checking shadows and reflections the way she had learned to do in her months on the street. A sound made her freeze. Footsteps trying too hard to be quiet. Emily pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps passed her hiding spot, paused, then returned. A man's voice, low and urgent, spoke into a phone. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that tone. It was the same one her aunt had used when discussing Emily with the insurance company right before throwing her out. The voice of someone planning something bad while trying to sound reasonable. But as she crept from her hiding place, a new sound caught her attention, the rumble of her empty stomach. She hadn't eaten since giving her bread to the old man, and the hunger was making it hard to think clearly. The shelter would have breakfast, but after yesterday's strange conversations, it didn't feel safe anymore. The corner store, where Mr. Chen sometimes gave her day-old pastries, was 3 blocks away. Emily stuck to the shadows, moving the way she had learned, quick and quiet, invisible to the early morning commuters hurrying past with their coffee cups and smartphones. She was halfway there when she saw him, the man from yesterday, Michael Warren, standing on the corner talking to a police officer. Emily's heart nearly stopped. She ducked into a doorway, pressing herself into the darkness, but not before catching a glimpse of his face. Something about his expression nagged at her memory. A familiar furrow of the brow, a way of tilting his head that she had seen before, though she couldn't place where. The conversation seemed intense. Warren kept shaking his head, gesturing emphatically while the officer took notes. Emily strained to hear their words over the traffic noise. The name sent a jolt through Emily's body. Catherine. Her mother's name had been Catherine, but it couldn't be the same person. Catherine was a common name, wasn't it? Still, the coincidence made her uneasy. "Easy there, sweetheart," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Mr. Thomas Warren just wants to talk to you. He's worried about his brother's interest in you." thinks you might be taking advantage of a man in a fragile state." Emily twisted away from his grasp, but he was expecting it. His fingers tightened around her wrist, still smiling that empty smile. "Come on now. There's a nice reward in it for you. Enough money to get off the streets, start fresh somewhere else. All you have to do is stay away from Michael Warren." He never finished the sentence. Emily brought her knee up hard, just like her mother had taught her, and as he doubled over, she twisted free. She ran, ignoring his shouts, darting through the morning crowd. The sound of approaching sirens made her shrink further into the shadows. Through a gap in the pallets, she watched a police car cruise past, followed by a familiar black sedan. Emily held her breath until they were gone, then pulled out the photograph from her pocket with trembling hands. The plastic bag was smudged, but intact. Inside, her mother smiled up at her, captured forever in a moment of happiness. They had taken the picture at the park, just weeks before the fire. Emily traced her mother's face with a finger, remembering how she used to brush Emily's hair back the same way when she was worried. As if in answer, her mother's words echoed in her memory. "Trust your heart, sweet pea. It knows things your head hasn't figured out yet." Her stomach growled again, reminding her of more immediate concerns. She needed food, and she needed to think. The library 2 streets over had a bathroom where she could clean up, and sometimes the librarians left out granola bars for the studying students. But as she emerged from her hiding place, Emily noticed something that made her blood run cold. Across the street, partially hidden behind a newspaper, sat another man in a dark suit, and on the corner, pretending to check his phone, was a second one. "No more running, Emily," he said softly. "Time to come with us." The last thing Emily saw before they pushed her into a waiting van was Michael Warren, too far away to help, running toward the sound of her scream. Then everything went dark. Michael Warren's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The image of Emily being forced into the van replayed in his mind, her scream still echoing in his ears. He had been too far away, too slow, too late, just like he had been too late to save Catherine. James sat beside him in the passenger seat, making rapid phone calls, trying to track down the van through his contacts. "Turn left here," James directed, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "One of my sources spotted a van matching the description heading toward the industrial district." The familiar streets of Cleveland blurred past as Michael pushed the car faster, ignoring traffic signals. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. He knew Thomas was behind this. His brother's fingerprints were all over it. The same calculated precision, the same careful timing that had characterized all of Thomas's business dealings. "Sir," James's voice cut through his thoughts, "there's something you need to know. I did the research you asked for about Emily's background." He hesitated. Something unusual for the usually unflappable man. The fire that killed her parents. It wasn't just any apartment building. It was one of ours. Warren Enterprises owned the building through a subsidiary. It was part of the low-income housing project that Catherine was investigating before she died. The one she said had serious safety violations. Michael's world tilted on its axis. Catherine Mitchell, Catherine's maiden name, the name she had given up when she married him, along with her past as an orphan who had fought her way through law school. Michael pulled the car over abruptly, his vision blurring. Are you telling me that Emily is... The world seemed to spin around Michael. A daughter. He had a daughter. And she had been living on the streets, suffering while he had been lost in his own despair. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Catherine's strange behavior before her death, her cryptic warnings about the company, her desperate attempts to tell him something important. James nodded grimly. There's more. The fire that killed Emily's adoptive parents, the electrical system that failed had been flagged for replacement months before. The work order was denied by the property management company Thomas had installed. A text message lit up James's phone. The van, it was seen entering the old Warren storage facility on West 53rd. As they approached the facility, Michael killed the headlights and parked in the shadow of a neighboring building. The van was there, parked haphazardly near a side entrance. Two men stood guard, their stances suggesting concealed weapons. "Sir, these men are dangerous. They're not just corporate security, they're professionals." Before James could protest further, Michael was out of the car, moving with the silent grace of someone who had learned to be invisible. The guards never saw him coming. A fire alarm pulled in a nearby building drew them away from their post, just long enough for Michael to slip inside. The storage facility was a maze of corridors and rolling doors, but Michael knew every inch of it. He had started his career here, learning the family business from the ground up. Now, those same corridors might lead him to his daughter, the daughter he had never known he had. "The girl's not talking," a rough voice said. "She's tougher than she looks." Michael's blood ran cold. He edged closer to the voices, peering around a corner. Emily was there, tied to a chair, her small face bruised but defiant. Thomas stood over her, his expensive suit incongruous in the dusty storage room. Two men flanked him, their stances professional, dangerous. The name hit Michael like a physical blow. There could be no doubt now. This was his daughter, his and Catherine's child, the daughter they should have raised together if he hadn't been too blind to see what was happening in his own company, his own family. The room froze. Thomas turned slowly, his face a mask of calculated concern. "Michael, I was worried you'd do something foolish. These men found the girl trying to break into our offices. I was just questioning her to find out why." Thomas's mask slipped for just a moment, showing the cold calculation beneath. "Your daughter." "Michael, you're not well. The stress of coming back too soon, the responsibility. You're imagining things." With each question, Michael moved closer, forcing Thomas back. The guards looked uncertain, awaiting orders from their employer. Emily stared at Michael, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperate hope. "The only thing I imagined was that you were ever on my side." Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "My own brother. How long were you planning it? How long did you wait, watching me work myself to death, pushing Catherine away, making it easy for you to step in and take everything?" Thomas's face hardened. "You never deserved any of it. You inherited everything while I had to fight for scraps of your attention. Well, I built something better, something stronger, and I won't let you destroy it with your pathetic redemption story." The guards drew their weapons, but Michael was already moving. Years of martial arts training, combined with the brutal education of the streets, took over. He dropped one guard with a precise strike to the throat, ducked under the other's wild swing, and drove his knee into the man's solar plexus. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thomas reached into his jacket. Metal glinted in the dim light. Emily screamed a warning. 2 shots rang out, deafeningly loud in the confined space. Michael rushed to Emily, his hands shaking as he untied her bonds. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have protected you." Before Emily could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. James had called for backup after all, and this time they would make sure the truth came out. All of it. Thomas was arrested, along with his guards. The evidence James had gathered, combined with Emily's testimony and the records of Thomas's corruption, would ensure he spent a long time in prison. But for Michael, watching his brother being led away in handcuffs brought no satisfaction, only a deep, aching sadness for all that had been lost. What mattered now was the small hand gripping his, the trust he would have to earn, the relationship he would have to build with the daughter he had never known. As they walked out of the storage facility together, Emily looked up at him. Michael squeezed her hand, tears rolling down his face. They had a long way to go, but they would go together. And somewhere, he hoped Catherine was watching, finally, at peace. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Emily sat in a chair too big for her small frame, watching Michael sleep. The doctors had insisted on keeping him overnight for observation after treating his injuries from the fight. The bruises on his face were already turning purple, but his breathing was steady and peaceful. Emily touched the bandage on her own cheek, remembering how he had stepped out of the shadows to protect her. She had spent so long not trusting anyone, building walls around her heart, but something about Michael's presence made those walls begin to crumble. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with pity or calculation, but with a mixture of love and regret that made her heart ache. James stood guard outside the door, his quiet presence reassuring. He had explained everything to the police, handling the chaos that followed Thomas's arrest with remarkable efficiency. Now, he coordinated with hospital security to ensure no one unauthorized could reach them. Emily had overheard him on the phone, his voice firm as he dealt with reporters trying to get the story. The sun was setting, painting the hospital room in shades of orange and gold, when Michael stirred. His eyes opened, immediately searching for Emily. When he found her, the tension in his face eased. Michael pushed himself up in the bed, wincing slightly. "Yes, I didn't know, Emily. If I had known about you, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. Your mother, Catherine, she must have had her reasons for keeping you safe, away from everything." Emily pulled out the photograph from her pocket, smoothing its worn edges. "She never told me about you, but sometimes when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her crying. She would look at old pictures and whisper things I couldn't hear." "This was her favorite spot in the park," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We used to have picnics there before everything went wrong. She would spread out this old red blanket and talk about her dreams for the future. She wanted to help people, to make the world better." Michael listened intently as Emily spoke about her life with Catherine, drinking in every detail about the years he had missed. She told him about the small apartment they had shared, about Catherine's job as a legal aid lawyer, about the bedtime stories and Sunday morning pancakes. "She never stopped loving you," Emily said quietly. "I know that now. She kept a box of letters she never sent, hidden in her closet. After the fire, when I went to live with Aunt Sarah, I saw her throw them away. I tried to save them, but—" Emily nodded, the old pain rising in her chest. "She said she couldn't afford to feed another mouth. That's when I started living on the streets. I thought maybe it was better that way. Everyone who tried to help me ended up getting hurt." "Listen to me, Emily," he said, his voice intense. "What happened to your mother, both your mothers, and to David, it wasn't your fault. It was Thomas's greed and my blindness that caused this. But I promise you no one will ever hurt you again." "Sir, the police have finished their initial investigation of the storage facility. They found Thomas's records, everything. The fraudulent building contracts, the falsified safety reports, even evidence linking him to Catherine's accident." Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying. The truth was finally coming out. Her mother would have justice. "My dearest Michael," he read aloud, his voice catching. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I know now that Thomas has been systematically destroying everything we built, cutting corners on safety to maximize profits, using the company's resources for his own gain. I've gathered evidence, but he knows I'm onto him. That's why I had to protect our daughter." Emily leaned against Michael's shoulder as he read, tears streaming down both their faces. The letter detailed Catherine's discoveries about Thomas's corruption, her fear for their safety, and her desperate decision to leave with their unborn child. "I wanted to tell you so many times," the letter continued, "but Thomas had already started poisoning your mind against me, making you doubt my stability, my judgment. I knew if I told you about the baby, he would find a way to use it against us. So I ran. I found a new life, a safe place for our daughter, but I never stopped loving you, Michael. And I never stopped hoping that someday you would find your way back to us." The letter went on, explaining how Catherine had discovered Thomas's involvement in dangerous cost-cutting measures across their low-income housing properties. She had been building a case against him, working with a small group of trusted lawyers, when she realized she was being followed. "I'm close to exposing everything," she wrote, "but if something happens to me, find our daughter. Her name is Emily, and she has your eyes and my smile. Protect her, love her, and tell her that her mother did everything she could to make the world better for her." Michael folded the letter carefully, his tears falling onto the worn paper. "All this time," he whispered, "she was trying to protect both of us." She was right. Michael looked at Emily, really looked at her, seeing Catherine in every feature, every gesture. "What happens now is up to you, Emily. I want to be your father, to give you the home and family you deserve. But I understand if it's too much, too fast." Emily thought about all the nights she had spent alone, clutching her mother's photograph, wishing for a family. She thought about Michael stepping between her and danger without hesitation, about the love and pain in his voice as he read Catherine's letter. Michael's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Breakfast sounds perfect. I make pretty good pancakes, though probably not as good as your mom's." Outside the hospital window, the city was coming alive with morning light. A new day was beginning, bringing with it the promise of healing, of family, of truth finally set free. Emily looked at Michael, her father, and felt something she hadn't felt since the night of the fire: hope. But even as she allowed herself to believe in this new beginning, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one more truth to be uncovered, one final piece of the puzzle that would change everything once again. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Michael's penthouse apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Emily stood in what would be her new bedroom, running her fingers over the soft blankets on the bed, a real bed, with pillows that smelled like fresh laundry and sheets without a single hole or stain. After 3 days in the hospital, they had finally been released, and Michael had brought her home. Home. The word felt strange in her mind, like a shoe that didn't quite fit yet. The room was bigger than the entire apartment she had shared with her mother, with a view of the city that made her feel like she could touch the clouds. But it wasn't the size or the luxury that overwhelmed her, it was the care that had gone into preparing it. Michael had asked her favorite color at the hospital, and now the walls were painted a soft shade of green that reminded her of spring leaves. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with both new books and worn copies of classics she remembered her mother reading to her. On the bedside table sat a framed copy of the photograph she had carried for so long, professionally restored but still in its original frame. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Michael stood there looking uncertain, holding a large cardboard box. Emily sat cross-legged on the bed as Michael opened the box. Inside were dozens of notebooks, all filled with her mother's neat handwriting. But these weren't legal documents or evidence against Thomas. They were journals, dating back to before Emily was born. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the first journal. The pages were slightly yellowed with age, but the words were clear. "My dearest baby, today I found out about you, and already I love you more than I thought possible." Tears blurred her vision as she read. Her mother's voice, so familiar and so missed, seemed to flow from the pages. Catherine wrote about her hopes and fears, about the difficult decision to leave Michael, about the joy of feeling Emily kick for the first time. She wrote about meeting David and Sarah at the shelter, about how they helped her start a new life, about the day Emily was born. "You came into the world fighting," Catherine had written. "The nurses said they'd never seen such a determined baby. In that moment, holding you, I knew I had made the right choice. You were worth every sacrifice, every moment of fear, every lonely night. You were my miracle." "Something's happening at the old buildings," Catherine had written. "David's been helping me investigate. His work at the shelter gives him access to records about tenant complaints. The evidence against Thomas is mounting, but there's something else, something worse. I found old adoption records in the company files, cases where Thomas used his influence to separate families, to silence people who knew too much. He's been doing this for years, manipulating lives like chess pieces. I have to stop him, have to protect my baby girl. But if anything happens to me, I've made arrangements. The truth will come out one way or another." Emily looked up at Michael, her heart pounding. The fire! It wasn't just about the building codes, was it? The next entry made Emily's blood run cold. David found something in the old records, a pattern of accidents, of families torn apart, and a name that keeps appearing, Catherine Warren. Not me, but another Catherine Warren from 30 years ago, Michael's mother. "I never knew her," Michael said quietly. "Thomas told me she died when I was a baby. Father rarely spoke of her, but according to these records, she didn't die. She disappeared after threatening to expose corruption in the company. Thomas was just a teenager then, but he learned from watching our father. He learned how to make people vanish. History repeated itself. Thomas couldn't let another Catherine Warren expose the truth, but your mother was smarter than he expected. She left a trail, pieces of evidence scattered in safety deposit boxes across the city. James has been finding them, one by one. My mother," Michael said. "Your grandmother. She's still alive, Emily. Catherine found her living under an assumed name in a small town in Michigan. That's why Thomas panicked. It wasn't just about the building codes or the fraud. It was about decades of secrets coming to light. James is bringing her here today. She's been in hiding all these years, thinking she was protecting me. When she saw the news about Thomas's arrest, she finally felt safe enough to come forward." Emily nodded, though her heart was racing. They walked to the living room together, where James stood with an elderly woman. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with age, but her eyes, Emily's eyes, were bright and alert. Emily found herself wrapped in an embrace that smelled of lavender and felt like coming home. 3 generations of Warren women united at last. As they held each other, Emily felt the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She opened her purse and pulled out an old leather wallet. Inside was a photograph Emily had never seen before, her mother as a young girl, standing in front of an orphanage. "Catherine wasn't just investigating Thomas's corruption," her grandmother explained. "She discovered that we were already connected, long before she met Michael. She was born in the same orphanage where I took refuge after fleeing Warren Enterprises. The same orphanage where Thomas's corruption began, using vulnerable children and desperate mothers to build his network of secrets." Michael sat heavily on the couch, stunned by this final revelation. So when Catherine started investigating the company, Emily thought about the web of destiny that had brought them all together. 3 generations shaped by the same man's cruelty, now united in its aftermath. She thought about her mother's courage, her grandmother's sacrifice, the love that had endured through decades of separation. Sitting there in the sunlit apartment, surrounded by her newfound family, Emily felt a final piece of her heart slide into place. The loneliness that had been her constant companion on the streets seemed to fade, replaced by something stronger, the unshakable knowledge that she belonged. Her grandmother pulled her close, and Michael wrapped his arms around them both. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, unaware of the miracle unfolding in the penthouse above. A family fractured by greed and corruption, finally made whole by truth and love. That evening, as the sun set over Cleveland, Emily stood at her bedroom window, watching the city lights come alive. The journals lay open on her bed, her mother's words a bridge between past and present. On her bedside table, 3 photographs stood side by side, her mother, her grandmother, and the new family portrait they had taken that afternoon. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing her a mug. Michael pulled her close, and together they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. Below them, the city stretched out like a sea of lights, each one representing a story, a life, a possibility. But here, in this room, their story had finally found its ending, or perhaps more accurately, its true beginning. The truth about the Warren family had come to light at last, bringing healing instead of destruction, love instead of fear. Thomas would face justice for his crimes, but his legacy of pain had been transformed into something beautiful, a family reunited, stronger for having been broken. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the steady beat of her father's heart, the warmth of knowing she was finally, truly home. Her mother's last journal entry echoed in her mind. "Remember, my darling girl, that love is the strongest force in the universe. It breaks down walls, crosses oceans, and finds its way through the darkest nights. And no matter what happens, it always leads us home." Home. The word fit perfectly now, like a key sliding into its lock. Emily smiled, knowing that somewhere, somehow, her mother was smiling too.